introduce Dr. Andrew Gonzalez, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Biology at McGill University. He also holds the Canada Research Chair in Biodiversity Science. And he's also the founding director of the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science. Prior to arriving at McGill University in Montreal, he spent 4 years as an assistant professor at the Université de Paris in France, and he obtained his PhD from Imperial College in England. Trained as an ecologist, Andrew works, I guess, on 3 broad major themes that deal with biodiversity science. Broadly put, they could be maybe grouped into the one is the evolutionary ecology of changing environments, 2, the maintenance of biological diversity, and 3, the link between biodiversity and ecosystem function. In 2010, Andrew served on the Council of Canadian Academies expert panel on the state and trends of biodiversity of science in Canada. And in 2011, he was awarded the Tomlinson Science Award in the Faculty of Science at McGill. Andrew's talk today will be Biodiversity Science for Global Environmental Change.
Everybody, thank you for that introduction, Professor Small. Thanks for coming back, everybody. I know what I've got the siesta slot, so I like to call it. Your bellies are full of sandwiches and nice sweet things, and you're going to fall asleep. So if I notice too many heads nodding, I'm going to whistle very loudly into the microphone. Jokes aside, stay with me, please. I want to, first of all, I want to thank the organisers of this conference, of the Muskoka Summit on Biodiversity Loss. Big thank you to Judy and to Jim Rusak for the invitation, and to everybody who's working behind the scenes, and to you all for coming today. So I want to talk about biodiversity science. This is something that I believe very passionately about, that we can actually do science and make it useful. And that involves scientists stepping out of the ivory tower, conveying their understanding and working with policymakers, NGOs, citizens, and engaging in this conservation conversation. So let me start to quote Charles Dickens in The Tale of Two Cities. These were the best of times and these were the worst of times. The last century has seen phenomenal economic progress and growth, and many millions of people have benefited by that. But there's been enormous collateral damage made to the environment, and here is a quote that captures that from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Changes in biodiversity due to human activities were more rapid in the past 50 years than at any time in human history, and the drivers of change show no evidence of declining over time. So we're talking about phenomenal rates of change that are challenging the adaptive capacity of life on Earth. They're challenging the adaptive capacity of human societies that depend fundamentally and absolutely on the biosphere and on those ecosystems. And we're having trouble keeping up. That's the bottom line. And secondly, you'll notice that it's drivers plural. So, the environment has changed fast over geological timescales, but rarely has the environment changed so fast along so many dimensions. Whether that be the climate, changes in gas concentrations in the atmosphere, changes in pollutants, all these things are happening simultaneously. And so this is what's most difficult, most depressing as a scientist if you're trying to provide solutions. So why do we believe that the last 50 years have been so difficult for what's the data? Why has it been so difficult for life on Earth? Well, here is a graph that comes from the Global Biodiversity Outlook, and it can be nicely termed as the Great Acceleration. These graphs are various indicators of economic change over the last 100 to 150 years, which we now fondly call the Anthropocene. And you'll notice that they all have the same trend. The one I'm most fond of is the number of McDonald's restaurants. I don't know if I've got a pointer here. Let's see, yeah, over there. Look at that. That's pretty steep rise in numbers of McDonald's restaurants. These are all indicators of economic growth, right? This is a business as usual projection of, that we should be in a growth economy. But the environment can't sustain a growth economy. 101 ecology that I teach to my undergraduates is that at some point you hit the carrying capacity of any living system. And yet we're not, economically, that's not our model. So we're dealing with astonishing rates of change driven by the global economy, which is obviously globalized and homogenized. And this has led to concerns that we are currently in or entering the sixth great extinction. So I would say that it's early days. We are seeing very high rates of extinction, but whether it's the sixth extinction or not depends what will happen over the next century. It's almost too late, but not too late. So that's my message of optimism. If we act now, we can halt things. What this graph shows you is by decade on the x-axis here over the next century. These are the predictions, or it's not a strict prediction, it's a scenario, if you like, because there could be many different lines we could draw on this graph, of the number of species, or the rate of species loss in the numbers of species per millions of species per decade. Okay, so is it 10,000 or 50,000 species per millions of species per decade? And there's one big take-home message. First of all, that it's ascending, that it's accelerating, so that by the middle of this century we will reach maximum rates, which are equivalent to 450,000 species per decade. And you'll note that then this line descends. And why does that descend? Well, predominantly because there are no more species left. No, that's not true. It's actually because these estimates are based on forest transformation and destruction. Of course, so this prediction is a conservative one because it's only about changes in forest habitat. But obviously at some point we're going to run out of forest to cut down, and certainly forest is rich in species. So we have what I'd like to say is 50 years to act, and probably less. And I think we should be obviously trying to do as much as we can to use biodiversity science to slow these rates. So what is the loss of biodiversity? We've talked about what biodiversity is, but we haven't really talked about what the loss of biodiversity is. So biodiversity being that variability of life on Earth, okay? So the loss of biodiversity includes the loss of species, but the loss of the variation of life on Earth, right? All this phylogenetic or evolutionary history that we've accumulated on Earth, amongst the life on Earth, is being eroded. So it's being eroded in several ways. It's being eroded through the loss of species, which is the familiar species extinction notion, but it's also reflected by changes in the number of genotypes. So obviously, for example, in this example of maize here, these are all the same species, but there are different genotypes of maize. Right? If we lose genotypes, we're also eroding biodiversity. Also different populations. So across a species range, on average, a species is made up of somewhere between 200 to 400 populations. That's a rough rule of thumb. But every species is made up of many populations, and losing a population or a local extirpation is a loss of biodiversity. And we're also losing whole ecosystems. Entire habitats or biomes are being transformed. And obviously this represents a much larger spatial scale, but it's also an important element of biodiversity. So why should we be concerned about biodiversity loss? Well, we've heard a number of reasons today. Some of them are fundamental to the way we view life on Earth and we view our role as on life on Earth. Some of these are ethical. So is it right to go on doing what we're doing? And this sort of evokes for me again the biophilia hypothesis of Ed Wilson, this idea that we're drawn to life, we have this fundamental link to life. But to decide whether it's ethically right or not depends upon how strong your link is to natural history. And if we're spending all our time disengaging from nature and our children are spending less time with nature, it's very difficult to answer that ethical question. Also culturally, we're founded upon natural history. Think about how much sculpture, how much art, how much literature, how much poetry, language is based upon the biosphere and where we're living. And then there are two other important aspects. One is that biodiversity itself may be important from a functional point of view. It might be essential to the way the biosphere works. And biodiversity might play a role like the parts of an engine play a role in making the engine go. In the way that the engine, we get combustion of energy and transform that potential energy into kinetic energy, so too maybe species are playing that role in the engine, which is the biosphere. And then our economy depends fundamentally and absolutely on biodiversity. We saw earlier on how species genotypes are used for the pharmaceutical industry, but for food and for fiber and for a whole host of economically important reasons. So those are the big four. I'm going to focus for most of my talk today on the number 3, on what is the evidence that we have that biodiversity plays an essential role in the functioning of the biosphere and the functioning of ecosystems. So there will be 4 key messages from this talk. First of all, that I want to conclude that rates of environmental change are challenging the adaptive capacity of life on Earth, and I want to test that. I want to see what is the capacity of life to adapt to current rates of change. I want to talk about a synthesis of knowledge. What do we know about how biodiversity affects ecosystem function and the stocks and flows of ecosystem goods and services upon which we all depend? I want to talk about how important biodiversity change is with respect to other forms of environmental change, other drivers of global change like increasing CO2, nutrient deposition and pollution, warming climates. Biodiversity change should be seen as a form of environmental change in its own right, but how important is it with respect to those others? Can we rank it? And I shall do that for you. And then obviously we're in a situation where we're talking about the erosion of the science of biodiversity change, of biodiversity in Canada. And I want to point out that there is no long-term program for biodiversity science in Canada, and that this is a shocking situation. We've had a geological survey of Canada for over 150 years. Geological survey of Canada costs only $70 million per year, only. I mean, it's peanuts, right? We should have the equivalent for biodiversity. So I want to close on what can we do to move forward. So to the first part. I've pointed out that rates of environmental change are challenging the adaptive capacity of socio-ecological systems. So what is the adaptive capacity? Nobody really knows. We don't know to what extent life on Earth is capable of dealing with current rates of change. And so I wanted to ask ourselves, is this, and we saw this figure earlier on, is this inevitable? Does this always go to 0? Or is there some inherent capacity for life to rebound, for these curves to turn up? Now obviously these are global averages and they don't represent the fate of any one particular population, because each curve represents the average of many, many populations. But what is the capacity for a population to recover after stress? Think of the bumblebee example that Dr. Kerr gave us today. Think of the many examples that we've had. We don't know in general what is the adaptive capacity of these populations. So for that, I'm going to use the word evolutionary rescue. This is an intuitive idea that maybe populations have this capacity to rescue themselves by adapting to environmental change. So, evolutionary rescue is the recovery of a declining population due to local adaptation under increased environmental stress. Okay? So here is a figure that will try to capture what I mean by that. So you've got time on this axis, x-axis, and then we've got the abundance of our population. I'm just going to focus on one population. Okay? And over time, there are 2 possibilities under environmental stress. So let's assume that our environment becomes lousy at this point here. Okay? Our population could decline exponentially to extinction, and that's what we're worried about in many, many cases, or it could take on this sort of iconic U-shape, which means that it's recovered. That there is a decline. This decline is exponential, but before the population hits this sort of critical phase, this critical density at which it's extremely sensitive to stochastic extinction, it adapts. That internally, inside that population, individuals that are tolerant to the stress start to reproduce, start to increase from rare, and take over the population. Okay? And we don't know in general what the capacity is for any population. We don't know how often this is likely. I want to point out a couple of features of this graph. First of all, we can predict, where the theory is in place, to say what are the important features of a population that might rescue itself. First of all, its starting population size under environmental stress, the bigger the better. And secondly, it's the period of time that it spends at this critical density. Okay? So at this point, it's very sensitive or at risk of extinction. So the quicker it can get away from this, like some rocket trying to escape from the pull of gravity, the better. Okay? And once it escapes, it can increase exponentially, and then it should be okay. And so there are theory tells us there are a bunch of things we should be looking for. We should be estimating basic population sizes. We should be estimating how maladapted our populations are with respect to that environmental stress. By maladapted, I just simply mean how quickly they decline once the stress has been applied. And then how much useful genetic variation is there in that population? It's that genetic variation that allows the population to adapt. You should all be familiar with Darwin's theory of natural selection. That's the basic idea there. There's useful variation in the population. Some individuals are tolerant and able to reproduce. And so this is a critical aspect. And if we erode genetic variation, we're eroding the capacity of our populations to adapt. And so a very far-sighted evolutionary biologist called John Maynard Smith had already foreseen this back in the late 80s, and he captures this idea very intuitively. He says population persistence under environmental change is a race between demography and adaptive evolution. So you can see that there's two processes going on. There's mortality due to the stress that's killing the population at an exponential rate, and then there's this sort of the happier side of natural selection, which is allowing evolution and the reproduction of those individuals that are tolerant. So it's the race. Which of those two sides, or those two partners in the race, wins will determine whether our population rescues itself. So at the time we were thinking about testing this, there was no data. I could have asked any scientist in the world and asked them what fraction of populations that are currently undergoing decline are going to rescue themselves, and we would have had an enormous range of guesses, and nobody knew. So for me, it was essential that we test this. And so in order to do that, we had to create these laboratory populations. We had to start somewhere. We couldn't start with caribou. We couldn't start in the wild with mammals, because we'd be still here in 1,000 years. So I had to start small. So we started small using a model organism that molecular biologists are very fond of, called baker's yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, and I used a robot to manipulate thousands, literally thousands of populations. And we studied the dynamics of extinction of these populations. Why did I use a robot, apart from the fact that I'm as geeky as Jeremy? Well, it's also because I could find no graduate student who was willing to do the experiment. So I had to employ a robot to do that. And just so that you're all familiar, he's called Robert le Robot, because we're in Montreal. So he was called Robert. And what's phenomenal about this is obviously there's a lot of fun. We can do a lot of fun things with a robot. Apart from the fact that it works 24/7, is that we can literally manipulate thousands of populations. And we can manipulate their genetic structure as well. So what we did is we grouped these populations under extremely stressful scenarios, under varying rates of environmental change to simulate global environmental change, and then we recorded how often we observed evolutionary rescue or how often we observed extinction. And so you remember we're looking for this U-shaped curve. So what we did is we started out with very large populations of baker's yeast. We hit them with extremely high concentrations of salt, which is very, very stressful for them, and then we watched their dynamics. And what you'll see is that in this particular experiment, so here we have the yield of those populations, how big those populations were over time. These populations reproduced once every 8 hours, and you'll notice that there was a nice U-shape. So these particular populations were able to recover after a phase of exponential decline. There was this trough here, the period at risk, and then they recovered. Okay? So that was great. We managed to corroborate the first aspect of that theory, that we could observe rescue. Okay? But as I said, one of the most important features of rescue is, what are the most important predictors of rescue is population size. How big is that starting population size? In this experiment, we started with quite large populations. But how does the probability of adaptation, or how does the probability of evolutionary rescue depend upon population size? And so, before I get there, I want to show you exactly what happens in these populations. If you take what we were expecting from theory is that at the bottom of this trough, there would be a few cells that were tolerant to salt. Right? Everybody was dying, but there were just a few cells that were tolerant. And so what you see here is if you take some of these cells out of the population and you spread them on agar with high salt, you'll see that each dot here represents a cell. Each dot here is a dead cell. And the cells that grew or were able to grow under high salt are represented by these colonies. So you'll see amongst this constellation of cells, 4 to 5 of them were able to reproduce and tolerate high salt conditions. So you'll see that what we'd observed was selection for tolerance to high salt. They were at a low frequency in the population, but these are the guys that were responsible for saving the population and rescuing it subsequently. But what about population size? So we got the robot to manipulate the initial population density. And we did this for many, many hundreds of populations. And if we can do that for many hundreds of populations, we can calculate the probability of rescue. And so that's what we did. So here you have the probability of rescue, where 1 is certainty, complete certainty that the population will rescue itself, and 0 is no adaptation. And then here is the initial population density. Okay, so this is of the order of tens of thousands, and here the tens of individuals. So in the absence of salt, what you can see here is that as you increase population, or let's go from this end, as you decrease population size, you'll see that we don't have any real effect on extinction. It's only when we get to very, very low levels of populations, very low population size, that we get any extinction happening at all. So this is like the control condition. Okay? But when we have salt and we stress our populations, you'll notice that the probability of adaptation starts to drop precipitously. Right? And so that in the presence of salt, you need much larger populations to maintain and to persist. And so we can ask ourselves, well, what's the critical population size that we need for some probability of adaptation? So if you wanted to have, say, a 50% probability of adaptation, we would need, in this experiment, roughly 500 individuals. Now, 50% probability is not great. That's like taking a coin, flicking the coin, and asking, did it survive or not? Normally, we want something with a bit more assurance, and we want something like 95% probability. So in that instance, what this experiment showed is that we would need up to or maybe more than 5,000 individuals, which, doesn't sound like very much. But remember, we are in ideal laboratory conditions. There are no competitors, no predators, no pathogens, no environmental variation. There was one stressor, and we were asking them to deal with one thing at a time. So what this is an extremely conservative estimate of what it would take to observe evolutionary rescue with a 95% probability. And so likely, the estimated minimum we're going to need is going to be orders of magnitude, maybe 50,000 in terms of population size. So this was the first attempt to evaluate whether life could help itself. And now we're doing the next phase of this research, is trying to do this in the field. And doing it with organisms like small vertebrates, like guppies and fish and annual plants. But of course, no population, these are all isolated populations, but no population is alone. All populations are embedded in a range, in a meta-population of populations, where there are exchanges of individuals between different localities. And so, and we can see this in this map. If you just focus on where we are in the world, you'll see the different colours here represent the percentage of decline of species, and you'll see that obviously where there are human beings living, this is where you see the greatest degree or percentage of decline in populations. You'll notice that if you are a species living in this area, then there's going to be a high spatial correlation in your decline, right? If there are 50 populations in that particular area, then they're all likely to be declining. But if you're a population in this part of the world, maybe only half of you, if you're a range in this part of the world, maybe only half of your populations are declining. So there's enormous spatial variation. Think again of that bumblebee example, in terms of their persistence and their likelihood of persisting. So we wanted to know whether that was going to change our conclusions. So let's think of a cartoon range of a species. So here you see this green blob represents a population. The bigger the blob, the bigger the population. And we can imagine that our species is represented by different populations, and then there's exchanges of individuals. Now we're going to impose a general environmental stressor, something like a warming of the environment. Okay? What we'd expect in the first instance, over time, is for our populations to start to contract. Right? They start at the beginning of this U-shaped curve. They start to decline exponentially. But then, and some of them might even go locally extinct. But others would hang around. And maybe we'd see the evolutionary rescue process. And that evolutionary rescue process would be fostered by the exchange of individuals between populations, the exchange of individuals that might be resistant in one population, moving to another population, and helping that local population to recover. So what we wanted to do was recreate this in the laboratory, recreate a species range in the laboratory, impose a stress, and study how these many populations responded. And we were interested in a couple of questions. First of all, does it matter how fast the environment changes across the species range? And secondly, does migration between populations, or the connectivity between populations, help that adaptive response? And I'm going to cut a long story short and boil it all the way down to some simple results. So what I'm showing you here is the number of rescue events. Okay? So 60 is the maximum possible. So each of our ranges was composed of 60 populations. So if all of them rescue themselves, these bars would be at 60. And then we have these different environmental treatments, right? One of them was which the environment was not changing at all. Then we had another one where the environment was changing slowly, and another one that was changing fast. So when I mean slowly, it was changing rapidly, that's changing in a broad scale in less than 50 generations, and if it was changing fast, it was changing in less than 20 generations. So what you see here is that the probability of evolutionary rescue depends upon how connected the range is. So if you have no exchange of individuals between populations, they're all isolated, then far more than half the metapopulation goes extinct. But if you start to have individuals being exchanged, then you increase the probability of rescue. And the population, the capacity of the population and the range to rescue itself goes up. Right, but what happens now if we have some history of environmental change, if our range has been exposed to the relevant environmental change, the environmental stressor? Well, now you see that migration doesn't matter anymore. All that matters is you've experienced some relevant selection, that the history of selection has prepared you for the environmental change that's about to occur. And so you'll see now that evolutionary rescue was much higher across the board and could be quite high. Right? More than 70% of our populations were able to recover under this stressful scenario. So I think these results are sort of, initially, they're reason for optimism. We're able to estimate the capacity of a population to help itself, and we need to be able to provide the conditions for that to happen. We need to maintain connected landscapes. We need, somewhat paradoxically, to allow our populations, we shouldn't protect them and stick them in a freezer or in a zoo. We should allow them to be exposed to ongoing environmental change. We're unlikely to reverse this environmental change now. So we're better to let the evolutionary engine, if you like, work with that change and help nature help itself. So we found that evolution can rescue large declining populations. We have a general theory that we can use to make models that will help us predict which types of organisms should be able to rescue themselves and when and where. And obviously from a conservation point of view, this is nothing new here. We're not saying that, anything that, conservation biologists haven't been saying for the last 50 years, but we're providing another reason for it. We're saying that if you want to have rapid evolutionary rescue, then it's essential to maintain connected populations, and it's essential that you maintain their exposure to environmental stress. So I want to move on to the second part of my talk now. So I've hopefully sowed the seed of optimism. Another aspect, important dimension of biodiversity science is what role does biodiversity play? What's the functional role of the species variability, this variation of life? What role does it play in the way that the ecosystems work? Okay? And this is a field that started, I kid you not, this is a field that started 20 years ago. In fact, it started just after Rio 1992, where ecologists were driven as en masse, as a group, to answer this question, from a political imperative, what role can biodiversity play, and is it playing a role that helps the efficiency and the energy transfer amongst trophic levels, and the business of how ecosystems work. And so I want to present to you today a summary, a synthesis of what we've found over the last 20 years. So this is the question. We wanted to know as a group of scientists, what happens if we manipulate genetic variation, species richness, and the functional variation in ecosystems? What will be the likely impact on the production of biomass in our ecosystems, the rate at which they decompose dead matter, or their capacity to recycle essential nutrients? So this is another way of asking this question, maybe in a more familiar way, is for each of these gorgeous looking ecosystems, how many species do we need? How many species do we need to have a viable ecosystem? Well, there is no single answer to that question. It's like saying how long is a piece of string, right? It depends upon the quality of life you want to have, or what the kind of ecosystem you want to have. But we wanted to know what would be the minimum threshold. What's the critical level below which you must not lower by the numbers of species before you start seeing the ecosystem collapse. So let me show you the basic idea of this in science. So what we do is we create this, if you're working in a grassland, typically what you'll do is you'll create a checkerboard where each square here represents a plant community, and those plant communities have had different numbers of species sown into them. Okay? And then we study how the ecosystem processes in those squares across that checkerboard and measure how the numbers of species influences the processes. Okay? So you can imagine this made-up situation where we have some squares that have been planted with one species, with a monoculture, others with 2, 4, 12, 32, etc., etc. And then every year we go back and we measure how much green stuff was produced, how much grassland was produced, how much nitrogen was recycled, how many dead organisms were decomposed. And so what we get is a measurement of the capacity of that ecosystem to do useful work. And we didn't know, really. We knew that probably it was going to increase, but we know that some monocultures do better than others, and that some monocultures are very productive. That's the basis of modern agriculture. Okay? But we didn't know in general whether highly species-rich systems could outproduce the best monoculture. So, in another way to put it, we didn't know whether communities that were made up of complementary sets of species that solve the environmental challenges in slightly different ways, whether they could outproduce systems that were dominated by a single, very productive species. That was an open question at the time. So, basically over 20 years, experiments were done at various scales, from laboratory settings to old fields in Minnesota, to across 8 nations in Europe, across climatic gradients, to get an answer that also stretched across more than 500 experiments, more than 500 types of organisms, 30 biomes, 5 continents, and produced a lot of papers and trained a lot of students. But finally, we think we've got an answer to this question. And it's rare that we, as a field, we come together and decide whether we've answered a question or not. And so I'm excited to tell you this is a paper that came out an hour ago. The press embargo broke an hour ago, and I wasn't sure whether it would or not, and so I was a bit on tenterhooks here. I wasn't sure that I could give you the results. So I'm going to give you some highlights of the results. If you really want to dig into these findings, then I encourage you to go and read this paper, where basically we drew together the greater good of biodiversity science, some of the folks who've been doing the most work in this particular domain, and we tried to get them to agree on what we know. And that's not easy. It's like herding cats, and there's a lot of back and forth, a lot of jostling, because some of it comes down to belief, some of it comes down to data, interpretations of data, but the things in this paper are an attempt at a consensus. It's a bit like in the 1970s when the medical world came together and said, cigarettes are bad for your health. We didn't have, the data at the time wasn't there, the long-term data wasn't categorical at that point, but it was obvious that if you smoke, you were going to get lung cancer. So this is what we were saying, but now we have strong data. And so the first consensus statement is that, and I'm very comfortable making this statement, is that there is now unequivocal evidence that biodiversity loss reduces the efficiency by which ecological communities capture essential nutrients, produce biomass, decompose dead matter, and recycle biologically essential nutrients. There's no point in doing the science on that anymore. We know this. Okay? Secondly, of the different types, you remember I showed you that graph, that it was this sort of saturating relationship? Well, because we've done so many experiments, we were able to test what the shape of this relationship was. So what this is called fondly is sort of the redundancy hypothesis. This is the idea, is that if you reduce the numbers of species in an ecosystem, initially you'll have no impact, all right? But then suddenly you'll reach some sort of tipping point and the whole system will collapse, right? Because you've gone too far in terms of the erosion of numbers of species. But we didn't know what it was going to look like. We didn't know whether it was going to be proportional, whether it was going to be a redundancy, or whether it was going to be something much more catastrophic. So what's the answer? So I'm going to have a little bit of a poll here. Who thinks that it was a redundancy response? Raise your hand. You're all sleeping. Okay, so you're not convinced it was redundant. Who thought it was proportional loss? Mm-hmm. And who thinks it's catastrophe? Wow, you're a cynical bunch. Pessimistic. Well, I can give you the results. So we're looking for these different shaped curves. So what you see here is that in percentages, in terms of the percentages of studies that found a particular response for different types of ecosystem functions. So first of all, for producer biomass, so the amount of plant matter that was produced, the amount of nutrients taken up by that plant community, and the amount of decomposition that was done. So the first thing to note is that you get all three types of relationships in any one case, but the width here of the arrow tells you the preponderance of results. And so you'll find that in most instances, we get this sort of redundancy or tipping point model. All right, so initially we see it's sort of business as usual, everything's going on hunky-dory, we're not too worried about extinction, nothing happening, and then bang, the system collapses. Only rarely, roughly like 10% of the time, do you get this proportional loss scenario. And for biomass production and nutrient uptake, you almost never get the catastrophic case. You do. The one difference is for decomposition. You'll notice that in 1 in 5 cases, we do get this catastrophic collapse. And decomposition is essential to the fertility of soils and to the productivity of agricultural systems. And so this is not a general take-home message. You cannot simply conclude that the outcome of manipulating biodiversity is always to get this redundancy result. We do observe this catastrophic outcome, i.e. very rapid change with few species extinctions in some very important processes. So what about this dominance versus complementarity issue? Remember, we didn't know what was going to be important. Was the complementarity of species, this true biodiversity effect, going to be important? And so we across all these studies, we were able to estimate the amount of the variation that we observed in ecosystem processes, and we were able to estimate whether it was due to the existence of a particular dominant type, or whether it was due to interactions between these species with very different niche complementarities. And it turned out that the variation is split this way. That 33% of the variation in our ecosystems is due to the dominance of a few keystone species that play a big role. And 60% of that, 66% of that variation is due to the complementarity between species. So that's good for biodiversity. This is a good argument from a policy point of view, is that if you want to have a functioning ecosystem that's doing its job of producing green stuff, food for herbivores, food for you and I, decomposing well, then you do need more than one species. It seems like a duh conclusion, but we found that across an enormous range of experiments, biomes, organisms, etc., etc. And it turns out that if you measure this over time, complementarity becomes more important. The longer your experiment runs, the more important the diversity effect. So you could grow an ecosystem with one species. That's what the whole of the central prairies of Canada and the US, essentially. But we subsidize those ecosystems to an incredible amount. We buffer them from variation, we pour nutrients on them, we protect them, we add water, we do all these things to make them productive. You need much less of that if you have a very diverse system. Okay, the fourth consensus statement, there are 6 statements in total, this is going to be the last one for this talk. It refers to the stability of communities. How likely are you to get a surprise, okay, under some future form of environmental change? As Jeremy was talking about today, we're expecting more surprises, more extremes. Turns out that the more species there are in your community, the bigger its capacity to buffer those surprises, to limit the total variation in that system. So what you see here is a cartoon of this idea. If this is the amount of production primary production of plant matter in a community, it'll bounce up and down because the climate is changing and weather is variable through time. But let's say there are 2 species in our system, okay, this green species and this red species, all right? And so at this point there is an environmental change, and the blue species didn't like it, okay, and it starts to decline and go to extinction. Well, fortunately in this system there is a red species that can compensate, that tolerates well that environmental condition and can maintain or take over the responsibility of producing. So this is the idea of what we call functional compensation, and it's essential to the stability of ecosystems. It's nothing more than your portfolio of stocks, right? You want to compensate for variation in the market, well, you do that by diversifying your portfolio. Well, ecosystems work in exactly the same way. But it took a lot of data and a lot of experiments to establish that, and to establish how many species you need to do that. So here is one particular example I'll give you. This is from a skate fishery in the North Sea. So here is the total yield, or the abundances, or the landings of skate from this fishery. You'll see from 1988 to 1997, and that's a remarkably constant fishery, right? But what was going on inside that fishery was remarkable. What we were doing is that, so what I've ranked here are the 5 dominant species that are harvested from that fishery, and they're ranked by their body size. So you'll see initially, not surprisingly, we were harvesting the bigger species first, and you'll see that they were declining. But as we preferentially removed the bigger species, it was the smaller species that increased to compensate for the loss of the bigger species. Right? And of course, that's great. That compensation is allowing that fishery to persist, or certainly it did. But the problem is that at some point you're going to lose, if you keep eroding that species diversity, you're going to lose that portfolio, that insurance capacity of your system to buffer environmental change. And so this is another essential reason why we need to maintain diversity. And here's a good Canadian example from Bristol Bay, or from Alaska, so it's not a good Canadian example at all. Why did you sell it to the States? So for the sockeye salmon fishery, these are the landings of this sockeye for these different local fisheries. Okay, so these are the spawning populations. You'll notice they're varying through time, but they vary through time differently in different places. So if you take the average across the entire Bristol Bay region, you'd see a fairly stable salmon population, right? But what lies beneath it is this asynchronous variation in populations below it. So humans have learned to exploit that spatial variation, but that's another form of this insurance, or this portfolio effect I was alluding to. The more species you have, or in this instance, the more genetic diversity you have, the more stable your system. So I'm going to whiz through this. I promised you that I was going to tell you how important biodiversity change was with respect to other forms of environmental change. If you consider biodiversity change to be a form of environmental change in its own right, how does it rank? How important is it in terms of its impact on the way the ecosystems function? Well, this is a fairly complicated graph, but I'm going to run you through it. So this is the percentage of species lost in our system, right? And this is the impact scaled between 0 and 1. So if it's -1, it means there's no functioning ecosystem, all right? So it becomes more negative the more species you lose, okay? So we can ask ourselves, what is the effect of losing 20% of species, 60% of species, or 80% of species? And what kind of other form of environmental change gives the same magnitude of change? And so, for example, here, this is O3, this is ozone, acidification, ultraviolet light, or drought. You'll notice if you want to get the equivalent of the modern day effects of ozone, you'd have to lose roughly, I can't quite see, help me, 60%, something like that. Acidification, over 60%. Ultraviolet light, which is a relatively weak effect in terms of the effects on functioning over the short term, somewhere like 30%. But a drought, a severe drought, is equivalent to losing many, many species. Now, of course, not all effects are negative. Increasing CO2 actually enhances plant production, or the production of some plants. And so there are some drivers that also have large negative effects. Large positive effects. So, for example, adding nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus obviously boost the productivity of our system, but we can equate that to the numbers of species that you would have to add or remove from a system. So the bottom line from this paper is that biodiversity change has a large impact, and is as important, if not more important, than all of these other forms of environmental change that have received so much press over the last decade or so. So biodiversity science is a complicated problem, right? We've got all this interesting natural science on the right here that I've been talking about for the last 35 minutes, 40 minutes. But of course there's a human template. There's the social science template, and there's the natural science template, and they're connected. They're connected by what our needs are in terms of the services that we obtain from nature, and they're connected by the impacts that we have, that our behavior has on the way ecosystems work, right? And so ultimately, if we're to solve the problem, we've got to connect with social sciences. We've got to understand how humans perceive something like the tragedy of commons, how they solve problems of shared resources and diminishing supplies of essential resources. And so this argument of ecosystem services has become crucial to affecting policy. From a Canadian point of view, ecosystem services are incredibly important. There's a paper back in 2005 that estimated that the Canadian borrow forest and all the services, the goods and services that we obtain from it, was equivalent to $93 billion per year. and that agriculture and forestry and fisheries were providing in the order of $28 billion per year. And invasive species were causing $4.5 billion per year in of damage in the agricultural sector alone. So, these are numbers that might be controversial to many of us in this room, but they're numbers that make a difference, and they speak to people trying to make decisions that are economic. So, what we wanted to know was, okay, we know that the role of biodiversity in ecosystem functioning, but what about the role of biodiversity in terms of these ecosystem services? Turns out that we hadn't really, the people who were working on ecosystem services were not talking to the people who were working on biodiversity and ecosystem function, talking about silos earlier on. And so we tried in this paper to get these two communities to work together. So we were trying to establish the causal chain, if you like, between the numbers of species that you have in an ecosystem, the impacts that has on its function, and then how much service it provides to a community. So I'm going to basically skim over and it's a huge review of the literature. We reviewed over 400 papers and 36 different diversity service relationships, and found that in some cases, increasing diversity, the prediction that we would get increasing diversity would have an increasing effects on the service was borne out. In some cases, the data wasn't sufficient. But there are many, many services that we looked at. In some cases, there was no clear evidence for strong biodiversity effects on services. But for these 15 different services, the balance of evidence was telling us that biodiversity is good for services. But the take-home message from my point of view from this part of the paper is that we need to do more work. 39% of the hypotheses were supported by data, 20% were not supported, but nearly 40% had insufficient data. So we're not in a position right now to say categorically the role in which biodiversity plays for this economic side of the argument, from the services side of the argument. So this is essential. Many of you know that we've now, the last year, has seen the creation of the equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. We now have that for biodiversity and ecosystem services. It's called IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. You'll notice that before it existed, there was no bridge between the scientific community and the work that was being done by the Convention on Biological Diversity. There was no link between research and policy and decision making. This is a very uncomfortable situation, because we had a divorce between what was the knowledge that was being generated and the relevancy of that knowledge. So now that we've created this panel, we can at least potentially provide a flow of relevant information to the policy arena. And the point of this paper that I just talked about was to put something in place, to have a foundation upon which policymakers could say, yes, we know that biodiversity plays a functional role, and it's essential to the functioning of ecosystems. So we're at what I would call phase 3, wrapping up my talk now. We're at phase 3. Are we ready? So let's say we didn't need any more science, and some would say that we already knew the answers to the science that I've just told you about a long time ago. But are we ready to use this science to prioritize the risks, to provide meaningful management options, and to improve our capacity to forecast? And in some cases, in fact, in many cases, I'd say that we're not ready yet to do this. But there's plenty of science out there that tells us what we should start doing. We have to start acting now and then adaptively manage our actions as we go along. So one example of optimism that I'm involved in right now is how do we keep biodiversity and ecosystem services going for a conurbation the size of Montreal with 3.5 million people and soon 4 million people? How do you reconnect this fragmented landscape so that it maintains biodiversity and ecosystem services? Well, my research team is designing an ecological network that maintains the connectivity of the green space so that organisms can move around that landscape, shift their range if they have to. Imagine you're a butterfly and you're trying to move north over the next century. How do you do that if you've got to cross the St. Lawrence River and a conurbation of 4 million people? So you have to re-green or add a green infrastructure in place to allow the maintenance of biodiversity and ecosystem services. And we know how to do this. We can run those computer models that Jeremy was alluding to earlier on, and we know that the key parameters that we need to look into, we need to modify the area of the network, the permeability of the habitat, the quality of the fragments, and by manipulating those parameters we can design these networks. And so what my team is producing are these sort of roadmaps, if you like. What you see in green is the habitat, the warmer the color, the more critical the habitat is to the overall connectivity of the landscape. And what look like highways here are where we're proposing to have corridors. And so what you'll see is we're proposing to lay down a green network that will allow us to make the most of what's left, but also plant many trees if necessary, restore landscapes so that we can maintain their capacity to adapt to impending climate change and to function as ecosystems. I just want to, I've got 2 slides left. Obviously, we're all a bit dazed by the omnibus bill and everything that's emerged from that over the last couple of weeks, and the loss of our capacity to monitor our ecosystems in this monstrous country is a catastrophe. Here is a quote from the Canadian Ecosystem Status and Trends report that I found was particularly revealing. In it, they said, long-term, standardized, spatially complete, and readily accessible monitoring information, complemented by ecosystem research, provides the most useful findings for policy-relevant assessments of status and trends. The lack of this type of information in many areas has hindered development of this assessment. So we can't even evaluate or assess the state of Canada's biodiversity and ecosystem resources with the current system, and we're dismantling and dismembering it as I speak. So we can't go on like that. So what I'm proposing to do, and in the way I did for Quebec, in the way I created the Quebec Centre for Biodiversity Science, was essentially a network of scientists and research centres to get together to work with museums, NGOs, to create something, a grassroots operation that will allow to have action on the ground, even if we don't have support from the federal or provincial governments, is to create a Canadian biodiversity network. So this may engage citizens, this may engage NGOs, I hope it does. But we have a network of field sites, research centres, universities. We have to start. We know who we are. Everyone knows everyone else. It's a small community. It takes a few phone calls and relatively little money to begin to create a consensus and a concerted action on this problem. So the vision is to provide, obviously, policy-relevant knowledge, but to do it anyway, even if we don't have support. So, to wrap up, I've shown you that rates of environmental change are challenging the adaptive capacity of life on Earth. Evolution can be rapid enough to slow extinction, but we have to help nature to help itself. Biodiversity change has massive impacts on the way that ecosystems work. That's categorical now, and there is broad scientific consensus on that issue. That biodiversity mediates ecosystem function in non-linear ways. We have to be beware of catastrophic responses, but there are also surprising tipping points in store if we keep going. And finally, Canada desperately needs a long-term biodiversity program. By long-term, I mean in perpetuity. We needed to do proper risk assessment and to forecast the state of Canada over the coming century. I want to thank my lab, my wife, my son, the money people, my collaborators, all the co-authors, and of course, the reason why we do that is for my new baby daughter, Charlotte, who, for her, I hope that she's going to have a Canada to grow with much more biodiversity than we're predicting. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. You just blew my mind with the network diagram of the green infrastructure for Montreal, because yes. I'm writing a paper that applies to the Kitchener-Waterloo region, and have a very similar graphic in my paper. So I was like, yeah.
You didn't say, I didn't hear you.
It was intro. The other aspect of that kind of project that has been kind of flagged to me recently, I am a resident in Burlington, where we recently had to shoot a black bear that came down through natural areas that were connected through our local green infrastructure, and we shut down public schools in the area. There was no capacity because we understand that the tag and relocate 3-strike system for bears was not functioning. There was no local capacity. It wasn't up a tree, so they couldn't do the trank procedure anyway. And so the bear died, and he was taken into the custody by the Wildlife and Habitat rep from 6 Nations, and so he met a very appropriate fate for a bear that unfortunately had to lose its life based on our ability to deal with wildlife making use of ecological green infrastructure in an urban setting. So how are we going to prepare our urban population for the use by wildlife of the networks that we're building?
I'm not sure how much of a problem it's going to be for some, a conurbation like Montreal. Certainly, there are going to be things that we like less. Some, skunks and raccoons and invasive species, and maybe even emerging diseases like the importance of rabies and Lyme disease. These things travel. There's no doubt about it, and you can't clean the world up. Corridors potentially and networks are going to foster those kinds of more negative aspects of life on Earth. But actually we can design these networks to have what we call modularity in them. So it's a way of creating a cul-de-sac in a network that limits the capacity of things that we don't like. You sort of like a sheepdog moves a herd of sheep into a particular area. Or with appropriate design, we can create these modular areas, these cul-de-sacs in the network that would allow us to trap it in a particular, if it's a disease, for example, or if it's a certain type of predator, potentially we can adaptively manage that scenario. I'm not sure, no one's ever tried it. In theory we can do it, but we won't know until we try. And we can't imagine it as this sort of one-slot solution. We lay down this network and then forget about it. It's not like a highway. Even a highway, we have to fix it, right? And so I think we have to think of this as long-term solutions, and it's got to be much better than the existing scenario where we have no green infrastructure and we have very low levels of biodiversity. They're doing very little for the ecosystems.
Hi, I found your rescue effect research on the brewer's yeast quite interesting, and
thank you.
You indicated that it was about 2% of the population that survived to rescue, and I'm wondering about the genetic diversity after the rescue and whether continued stochasticity would, that it might have the chance to rescue itself once, but it may only have the chance to rescue itself once. I'm wondering if you've looked more closely at the genetic diversity.
That's an excellent question. So we've done follow-up experiments where we've hit them several times, and how many hits can they take? Turns out that those tolerant populations or those resistant populations are very resistant to subsequent hits of the same type of environmental variation. If you give them some other challenge, obviously, then they are quite a particular solution to a particular problem, and so they're susceptible to that. So the next generation of experiments we're doing now is we're asking these populations to adapt to multiple stressors. So if you're adapting to warming plus salt plus a pathogen, a disease, then what is rescue possible? Is it possible with the same probability? And what's the genetic variation looking like? To come back to your particular question of the genetic variation, so we know that this is variation that evolved during the experiment. These are beneficial mutations that are occurring during the experiment because the population started isogenically. So that was the evolution of useful variation during the experiment. And we know where those mutations were because we sequenced those particular. We know which proteins are involved in dealing with stress.
Thank you.
I have a question. You were talking about genetic variation and changing. In several conversations I've had over the last couple of months, people have been talking about the fact that we as people are going to have to start actively manipulating ecosystems in order to be able to assist them to evolve because they can't evolve quickly enough to stay up with, say, climate change. So we might have to look at what we're planting as a more southern species instead of a northern species, or manipulate lakes so that they have more oxygen in the bottom because they're losing oxygen because of the warmth. What's your opinion of sort of this active manipulation?
Yeah, I think this comes down to sort of intelligent restoration. We know that restoration's got to happen, and I think the science of restoration was slow to get going, but it's really taken off over the last decade or so. I'm all for it. Obviously, I'm not all for naive, blind management, but I think something that's been in the literature for a long time is this idea of adaptive management, of learning from your mistakes and adjusting your actions as a function of that. So one very controversial idea right now is called assisted colonization, as you alluded to. This idea that we know that populations are not going to be able to spread fast enough to the north, so why don't we take individuals from the south and put them where they're going to be, or where they're supposed to be, based on our predictions. Okay? Well, that obviously raises all sorts of ethical issues about the spread of populations, and some of them might be invasive, may have huge ecosystem effects, and we don't know where they're supposed to be and when they should get there. So it's sort of, playing Russian roulette. But the results from the robot experiment, when we recreated the range, I spared you all the details of that experiment, but it turns out that the populations that adapted the best in terms of their long-term capacity to reproduce in the presence of environmental variation were those at the range margin. Not those populations that were in the happy core of the range. So it's those guys that already experienced tough conditions, those seemingly small populations, those weedy populations, were the ones that had the capacity, had the useful genetic variation that was latent in their population that would then rescue themselves. So instead of ignoring or forgetting about the range edge populations and just only fostering the range core population, we've got to be doing the inverse. We've got to be, again, helping those marginal populations get through the critical phase, which is now, where there's rapid change going on, buffer them a bit, maintain that genetic variation, maintain their population size as much as possible. But in my opinion, I don't think we should be taking individuals from the core of the range and moving them to the north. And probably Professor Kerr disagrees, but I don't know if he does, but it's controversial.
Oh, I just want to add to the fact that has a very profound implications for additional considerations that are being entertained by the federal government right now to eliminate so-called peripheral species from the species at risk, essentially list.
Absolutely.
So that essentially, if Canada doesn't have a large proportion of global responsibility for that species, then it would basically take itself out of the equation. And that result confirms the importance, which has been thought for a long time from an ecological adaptation perspective, of those peripheral populations.
That's absolutely. It's a devolving of our responsibility to the long-term viability of those ranges, those species. And they're in the northern edge of their range today, but in a century from now, they're going to. This is where they're going. All else being equal.
So it's 5 after 3. I know we want to wrap up, but I'm just going to bring it back locally. And we live in the land between, so we are the south of the north and the north of the south. We are the transition between the Shield and southern Ontario, so many of those edge species, those edge of range species,
yes,
are here in Muskoka, and we need to be looking after them. So on that note, I'm going to pass it back to John.